So here we are. Just going to say at the front, if you haven't yet watched episode 3 of The Acolyte, we're going to get into some major spoilers here this evening. Let me know who's here. Thanks for joining in the chat. And I really am not quite sure what to think about this episode. I know that there's been a lot of chatter going on before the episode about that this is going to kill Star Wars, that this is the end. I've got some thoughts on that. I've got some thoughts about what that was. But let me know in the comments, what did you think about this episode? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Where are you? I'm much closer to the not liking it. I really didn't like certain aspects of this episode. I think there are some things that potentially are canon breaking, that are potentially going to change things in the Star Wars universe, or at the very least, changing how we look at so many different aspects, particularly around the Force. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about what I think about the reveal that May and Osha are born of dark side Force using from the witches. At least that's what it comes off as. And what does this do, and how does this impact everything else from this point forward in the Star Wars universe? Is this the point that Star Wars fans are going to look at and go, we're done, it's over? I'm pretty close. I'm pretty close. And if it probably wasn't for this YouTube channel, just to even find out what's happening, I probably would not keep watching Ahsoka. I can't even. The Acolyte. I stopped watching Ahsoka too. But that's what happens. So let's get right into it. The first thing that smacks you in this episode as everything starts is the idea that the Force is a thread. And I have two thoughts on that. First, I think it's possible that the Force being a thread is not undermining, possibly, and not pushing away what has been. This idea that the Force is being tugged at or pulled at as a thread could be, now hear me out, this is maybe just a nuanced reaction, not just pushing everything aside, giving the benefit of the doubt. The Force as a thread could be this coven's perspective of the Force, not just a realtering of how the Force is meant to be. I think that is a fair and nuanced step back perspective. I still don't like it, but if it's stuck with just this coven and not a demand of this is the Force now, I think that is a little different. I think a lot of folks were coming into this saying after episode 3, clearly, emphatically, the Force is going to be female. I think you could read that in. I think if you were coming to this episode without any knowledge of that, I don't know that you would immediately leave with that understanding. I still didn't like the episode. I still think there was a lot wrong with it. One of the things that kind of made me chuckle the most about the whole thing is, as I sat down to watch this, my wife decided to sit in the room. She wasn't ready to go to bed yet, and she's a makeup artist, and she was kind of just chuckling at the makeup. And then I told her the budget of the show, and she goes, "There's no way. There's no way." I'm like, I don't know what they spent the money on, because it wasn't the makeup. It kind of comes off a little cheesy, and I think that that's a fair criticism, and that's coming from someone who doesn't have a fight in the ring or anything like that. And that was one of the things I did feel that it just felt a little weird, a little off. It didn't quite give the feeling of Star Wars. There were a few moments, particularly in the scenes with all of the coven together, like when they started that ceremony, there was weird laughter in the back. It just didn't, I don't know, it didn't connect. It felt very off, and it felt very off in the sense that they're set up to be the ones that are killed in this episode, and Soul says that it's because of what May did with the fire. but we clearly know that's not the case. Why is Soul there? Why is Soul the only one there? There's definitely more going on to this, and based on at least what May thinks, she's going to pull the conclusion, and based on how Kalnaka will spend the rest of his time and Torben, it seems like this is being set up as the Jedi are the ones who are in the wrong. And really, honestly, that's the thing that bugs me the most about this entire episode. I can write off the Force is a thread type stuff. Well, actually, there's one thing that bugs me more. We'll get to that. I can write off the Force is a thread. I can say that's just one Coven's perspective. It's not the perspective of the Jedi. It's not even the perspective of the Sith. It's not the perspective of how the Force is talked about in any other Star Wars anything. So it could just be this little sect, this little group that believes that. Fair. When you're saying that it's the Jedi are the ones that are going and basically force policing out the use of anyone being able to use the Force. Now, I understand some of the reasoning for that. I understand that that is being set up because they're balancing the Force, and they are balancing the Force by making sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be. In essence, how we understand the balance of the Force to be, which is to limit the dark side use. So if children are being trained, you could make the case that there's a considerable reason why they might be worried that children are being trained in the Force, particularly if they're being trained in the dark side of the Force, particularly if they're not being trained well and they're being trained in such a way that is going to cause more problems down the line. So I think you can make a case that it's probably reasonable that people are not allowed to train in the Force because of what has come, because of what has happened, because of getting rid of the Sith and bringing balance to the galaxy was so difficult. And if you go back through the lore, you can understand all of that going back through the High Republic time and things like that. But when we're talking about setting up the Jedi to be the ones literally in the wrong and the ones that show up and have already invoked all this fear and they're ready to fight and they're angry, and that's not the Jedi. It's just not. That's not who we see as the Jedi depicted in any form. Now, it's possible to say that there are a few that would maybe have left the Jedi Order and went and done their own thing and became selfish and fell to the dark side. That's fair. But to say that this is what the Jedi are about, taking children, that it's within their right. I wrote down the quote. What is it? Trinity said at one point when they showed up, I can't remember what it was. You cannot deny the Jedi from testing. Kind of this, it's the law. We're allowed to do this, and they were pushing back, saying, "Well, the Republic isn't here. You can't do this." And ultimately, they let it happen. But it definitely came off of this, like, they're in the wrong. They're not allowed to do this. They shouldn't be allowed to do this. This is unfair. These are our kids, and to a degree, that makes sense. But then you step back and you understand that the reason for this is because people are abusing the Force, that they're training in the dark side, and without the regulation, without the specifically without the guardrails to keep people on the road, then of course it could go way out of control and cause more problem than good. It's one thing to say, and it feels like, here's what it kind of feels like. It feels like they're the Force police, and they're being made out to be the Force police by looking at and saying, okay, here's the speed limit. You have to follow the speed limit. If you go above the speed limit, you're going to get a ticket. And while, I think that's kind of exactly what they're doing, I guess the backside question to that is, should they be wrong for limiting the use of training that becomes very dangerous? I think you can't separate the religious connections that are being made here. And particularly, I don't know if you caught this, but a number of the connections that were made during this coven ceremony. There was one line basically ripped right out of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and it said the idea was the not separating, right? I don't know if you heard that line. I'm trying to see. I wrote it down. Here it is. The quote, basically, what the thread has tied together, no one can separate. That's basically a quote directly from Matthew 19:6, which Matthew 19:6 says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And so it's pulling on these cultish ideas of the coven to look at the Force in a religious way, similar to how the Jedi look at the Force in a religious way. And I don't mind that setup. I actually think that going into these other groups that use the Force is interesting. The issue I have is the way it's being set up, and has already been set up in the first 2 episodes. And some folks were saying, how can you criticize the show? You only have seen 2 episodes. Well, I can criticize based on what I've seen and based on what it feels like it's clearly going. And when you're setting up Endara and Torben and Kalnaka and even Sol to be clearly in the wrong, to the point where you offer poison to a Jedi and say, hey, either confess your sin to the High Council or take this poison. Those are your options. Clearly he's done something wrong. And so clearly the blame is on them. And then at the same point, he doesn't fight it. He doesn't push back. So he's recognizing that in essence, he's accepting that he's being judged by May in that instance. And so you bring that context into this episode, and the cliffhanger ending of the coven is dead and we don't know why, and May is still alive. She's at the tree, and Osha's separated, and Sol is promising her that she'll never feel that way again, though we don't see anyone else really. Sol is the only one we really see in the temple, if that's even what it's called. And so it felt like this shouldn't have been one episode, or shouldn't have been a single episode. It should have been a longer episode. And even though this was the longest episode they've released yet, it still felt like, man, there wasn't that much, and it really could have gone further, but they're trying to do the cliffhanger, end at the episode. I get it. And maybe it's just I don't like that aspect of the TV shows. I think that's part of it too. But when we're getting so little screen time, it kind of is rough. And so they're pulling on these religious views and perspectives. So if this is set up as the Coven's only perspective of the Force, and they look at it this way, it's very different than the idea that we get in the rest of Star Wars, where we talk about how everything works together and how you have the light and the dark differentiating the Force. They don't seem to see it that way. They see it just as a single thread, which also goes against the difference between the living Force and the cosmic Force, and how the cosmic Force brings about and communicates the will of the Force. Like, these are core understandings and foundations of the Star Wars universe. And so I think, to be fair, whether or not that's being redefined is yet to be seen. And that's the fairest I can be. I think it still could be redefined, but if it's made to not just be this Coven's perspective, but yet to be the perspective it should be, and that the witches are in the right for that perspective, not in the wrong, I think that's where we start to run into issue. That's where we start to run into issue with canon. And speaking of canon, let's get to the thing that I think is the most frustrating, and I had talked about earlier on a previous video, and others had said it, so I didn't come up with it, but this idea that somehow May and Osha are born of the Force, that they are one but two, that this whole poem that they have back and forth, and clearly there's one of the mothers. I wrote her name down, but it doesn't matter. The mother with the weird makeup, who was the one who carried her or birthed them, and the other mother is the one who brought them about by seemingly dark force something, because the Jedi aren't going to allow that to happen. So is it just because they're Force users they're not allowed to? I mean, I could see why the Jedi would do that, but it's not as if they are saying you can't use the Force. They're asking not, or the rule is not to say you can't use the Force, because then they would have been there for a very different reason. Instead, what they're saying is you can't train up children in that way, which I guess you can make the case is bad, but I think it's good. But so back to this. I think that the problem is when you have children now being conceived by the Force in this way, man, I think that that's problematic. I think that that's super, super problematic for the Star Wars universe. I don't know how you get around that. I really, really don't know how you justify in any way, shape, or form the fact that this was a unique thing. This was a very unique thing in Star Wars. This wasn't, this was limited just simply to the very specific case of Anakin Skywalker being born of the Force, being the one who is fulfilling the prophecy of the Chosen One. And honestly, it's really frustrating that they would take this angle, that they would take this perspective, that they would take this storyline. Now, again, I'm not saying because it happened once it couldn't happen again, but when you're talking less than 100 years from when it happens with Anakin, and it was supposed to be this unique, rare thing, I think it really does cheapen the birth of Anakin. I don't know how you could say otherwise. I don't know how you could say that this is its own thing and it's different than that, because if people have the ability to bring about Force users by using the Force and impregnating someone, and while doing the impregnating, they're also retaining the physical characteristics, I think that starts to get really strange. What are we talking about? And how in the world is this something, if it's happening here, how has it not been happening before? How is it not happening in the future? Because it's not, is that how Rey was born? Is that what we're going to find out? Is that going to come about in this? Is that how every now strong Force user, that's how they can get around the whole, they didn't need to be trained very much because, they were just born of the Force? But we still see, even in the earlier episodes, Osha's separated from the Force somehow. So I don't quite understand the thought process there. I don't quite understand why they would go that direction. And, I guess I do know why. Because they don't care. They don't care what has been. They're only going to do what they want to do. And is this the silver bullet, the end of Star Wars? No, I think Disney Star Wars has been its own thing for a long time. And the people that like Disney Star Wars are going to like Disney Star Wars. And the people that don't are not going to like Disney Star Wars. Does this turn off the show to some people? I think it will. I think you're going to see a steady drop-off of people who choose not to watch the rest of the show because, quite simply, it's going to keep diverging from what we know Star Wars to be. And again, I am not making a case on any of this being about race, gender, about ideologies or sexuality or none of that. I am not making a case for any of those things. I'm just talking about the show as we've been given. I don't think it works really well. It just doesn't. It doesn't grip you. It's not that interesting. We've now been through 3 episodes, and all we've gotten is a little bit, think about all we've gotten, and we got all of that in the first 5 minutes of of the opening first episode. And it's just been maybe a little bit more from there, but it's not really progressing the story very much. And when you look at those first 2 episodes, it was just so much exposition about all of those things that it's just, I mean, you could have probably had this been a flashback sequence in half the amount of time or even less, and it be just about the same, and you could have had that all in the first episode. I think the pacing would have worked a lot better. I think you would have had a lot more interest in these characters going back and forth in the same episode between adult and young to flashback to not. Like, I don't know. I'm just not that excited for where this is going. Because I can already see episode 4 is going to be the Jedi, and it's going to be showing what is all wrong with Torben and Kalnaka, because they're the only 2 that really matter that are left, and that's probably what we'll end up. We'll probably end up there, and seeing why is Kalnaka separated, and I'm sure then that will interweave in some way, or we'll just get a whole nother 16 years ago episode. And I think that's as good as we're going to see. And unfortunately, I just don't find that interesting. It's just not. And you add to the fact that it's going to do all these other things. You add to the fact that what I saw in the first 2 episodes really just made me not be interested. If you didn't see my previous episodes, you can go look at that. I think some of the characters they're building are just not there. And I mean, the best thing I can say about this episode is I didn't turn it off immediately. But other than that, it just was not that great. And even if you go the opposite direction and say, okay, and it does come out, like I've been gracious. Now let's go the other direction and say they're now redefining the Force to be known and understood as a thread, and anyone who thinks about it differently is wrong. If that's the direction they're going, and it kind of felt a little bit that way, particularly when the quote was, "The galaxy isn't a safe place for women like us," and that's supposed to mean, I'm guessing, women who use the Force or use the dark side of the Force, because nothing about what we saw felt like the light side. It didn't. I'm sorry, like that whole ceremony, I mean, and even everything we've seen from witches in other mediums in Clone Wars, when we've seen Mother Talzin, when we've seen in Ahsoka, like, the witches are not meant to be connected to the light. And I think the whole point of the show has already been stated, that they're trying to go into this gray area where it's not just light and dark, good and bad, evil and good. But that's a lot of what Star Wars is. And so it's trying to redefine and change, and it's trying to do this moral gray area with the Force itself, which I think that's what a lot of people are pushing back on, and what a lot of people are looking at, and myself included, and thinking, why? Why should I? Why should I consider this at all? I think that's a reality that we have to think about. And why should I consider this moral gray area of the Force when that's not how this has been at all? I think you can have people, Force users, who are morally ambiguous. But when we see the very definition, and this is what it gets back to, the understanding that Leslie Headland has of the Force itself is absolutely, completely wrong. I've shared this in other videos, but again, she continues to say, and has said in interviews, that balance of the Force is about balancing out, like on a teeter-totter, balancing out the light and dark. But that just simply is not how we understand the Force. That is not how it works. The Jedi have been tasked with keeping balance in the Force, and how do they do that? They do that by destroying selfishness and leaning into selflessness. because selfishness leads to the dark side. It doesn't lead to good. Selfishness does not ever lead to good. Now, there'll be some that say, don't you have to be some amount of selfish to care for yourself? And to even survive in this world, you have to be selfish. And I would actually push back on that. I think you can live selflessly. It isn't selfish to care for yourself. It isn't selfish to eat food. It isn't selfish to make yourself breakfast. I think that's a misusing and a misdefining of what even selfishness is. Selfishness is to put yourself in a position that you put others down and you choose yourself first. So selfishness is to refuse giving food to someone else and keeping it for yourself. That's selfish. It's not selfish to just make yourself food and share some of it so that someone else can have some too, right? And so you can survive without being selfish. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point of everything. That's the whole hero's journey restoration arc we see for Anakin, is this pull to selfishness and hate. And it's an act of selflessness of Luke that breaks him from that. And then he's restored and redeemed in his actions because he does the most selfless thing anyone can do and gives his life and trades his life for that of Luke Skywalker. That's what Star Wars is. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this balancing of the Force, is an eradicating, is a destroying of selfishness, is a destroying of the dark side. But that's not what this is being set up to be. And I think that's my biggest frustration, that I could even see past some of the other issues other people have. I think the writing has been weak. I just didn't feel it in this episode in many different respects. Like even just looking through my notes here, they say this, the quote here is, "This is not about good or bad. This is about power and who is allowed to use it," right? That right there is the very definition that they're taking and putting forward as the Force. And of course, they're also then using that to talk about other things as well. Yo, John Adams is here in the chat. What's up, my guy? Glad you could be here. Not so great. Not so great an episode. But I also don't think the people that have said that this is the worst piece of Star Wars ever made, I wouldn't go that far either. I have issues, big issues with the episode, but I don't think it is. I don't think it's the end the way that some have said. But it just shows, I think, for me, that I'm really not that interested in this show. I probably am not going to watch more of it, or I'll just watch people's recaps of the show because I don't really want to watch it anymore. I don't know. Did you get a chance to watch it yet? Or did you just hop on to say hi? Which either is fine. I won't spoil anymore. But I think this idea of that the Force is not about good or bad, but it's all this about power and who's allowed to use it. Let's ask ourselves the question, should everyone be allowed to use the Force? Is there an instance when the Force should be deemed unusable by certain individuals? Are there any rights that should be or could be taken away or limited because of the individual? And I think that's what's trying to be set up here. Is it's being set up as we're not allowed to use the Force because we're women. And that is not what the Jedi are doing. That's not it at all. The Jedi are about keeping balance. And how does that balance come about? That balance comes about by destroying selfishness, by destroying the dark side. This is why the Jedi do what the Jedi do. This is why they take those who are highly Force sensitive and train them towards selflessness. Now, there's some that'll still disagree with that and say that they shouldn't train them. I say, well, they also don't do it without permission. They don't do it without permission. Look at the prequels. Look at that whole scenario. Does Qui-Gon kidnap Anakin Skywalker? No. Does Anakin want to go and be a Jedi to a degree? Is he worried? Is he concerned? He doesn't want to leave his mom. But he makes a decision, and he goes with his mom's permission. A hard decision, no doubt. A hard decision, but still not a kidnapping. There's definitely a sense, don't let them see the kids. They know what they're doing is outside the bounds. And when they're talking about that, this is not about good or bad, but it's about who's allowed to use it. Again, they're getting a misunderstanding in the reading of what balancing the Force even means. Well, I'm glad you're here, John. John, if you don't know, I'll shout it out. John's got an awesome tech channel. It's cracking off. So if you like iPads, well, he's done with iPad reviews. But if you want to go read iPad reviews or watch iPad reviews, go check out his channel. He's a friend, and I'm glad you're here. You should go watch it. I will encourage you to watch it because I don't think it's terrible, but I also think that the way that it handles some of these topics in the Force is completely going the wrong direction. And so that when we're talking about who's allowed to use the Force, when you have a right understanding of the balance of the Force, you can come to a right understanding of who is and isn't, or who should and shouldn't be allowed to use the Force. Because we can all agree that if certain folks had never been allowed to train in the Force, it would have been a net positive for the galaxy, period. If Palpatine had never learned to use the Force, if he was never trained, it would be a net positive for the galaxy. And so this law that they're reacting against has, I think, actually a legitimate reason to be there. And just because they want to also isn't necessarily a good enough reason. I think we need to exist in boundaries. And I don't see that the boundaries here would necessarily be wrong or necessarily make the Jedi be evil. But when you combine the law-keeping police officer kind of vibe along with the guilt and the shame that is heaped upon them in the first two episodes, I get the sense that it's going to be more. So I don't know. I'm going to probably sleep on it and put some more thoughts together, and I'll put some videos out. But let me know down in the comments what you thought of this episode. I appreciate you stopping in, even if it just for a little bit. And remember, the Force will be with you always. If you want to check out my reviews of the first two episodes, you can click right here. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later.